Alexander the Great, of Macedonian Greek royalty. His reputation is known all around the world.
Alexander was born great, he achieved greatness, and he had greatness thrust upon him.
He was trained to not only be wise, but to be one of the world's greatest conquerors. His wars against the Persians are legendary. He was even crowned a pharaoh of Egypt. But why was this foreign man welcomed into Egypt? Was there something more to his presence here? Or was it because of the close ties between Greece and Egypt? Alexander is surrounded in myth. He ventured out far into the desert to speak to the Egyptian oracle at Siwa. I'm literally walking in the same footsteps as Alexander the Great. But what really happened here when he was proclaimed as the son of the god Amon?
Alexander the Great, he wanted to prove to the Egyptians and to all the world that he's not only human, he's the son of God.
For 2,000 years, the story of Alexander in Egypt has been simmered down to barely a footnote. Now, join me, Curtis Ryan Woodside, as I investigate what Alexander really did during his time in Egypt and discover his legacy as a pharaoh who emulated the greats before him. The mysteries behind Alexander's death and afterlife. We learn about Alexander's brother, Philip III, who became pharaoh after him, as well as Alexander's mother's plots to retain Egypt and the empire. Come with as we reveal Alexander, the Great Pharaoh. Alexander III was born as a prince of Macedonia in July 356 BC in the Greek Macedonian state of Pella. His mother was named Olympia, and his father was King Philip II. Alexander grew up being well educated by some of ancient Greece's most notable men. Apart from being very intelligent, ancient sources write that Alexander had a great love of reading and learning about many different subjects. The young prince was very determined and hardworking. At his young age, he didn't care much for frivolity.
I think three people had a huge influence on Alexander: Aristotle, his father Philip, and his mother. In fact, I feel the influence of Aristotle, the most learned and celebrated philosopher of his time, cannot be underestimated. When he was appointed the tutor of the young prince, he was given the task of educating the future king. Aristotle, a polymath, taught Alexander an array of subjects, including philosophy, ethics, science, and politics. It was an education aimed at not just creating a knowledgeable ruler, but also a wise one. It's also interesting and wonderful, actually, that he instilled in Alexander a curiosity about the natural world. This is evident by Alexander's support for scientific research during his campaigns, including the cataloguing of new plant and animal species, and also the founding of the city of Alexandria, which later, under the Ptolemies, would house the famous library and also would become the cultural hub of learning and research.
He was also trained as a soldier from a very young age. Although much of his life would have been comfortable being a prince, he and his family did face many challenges, particularly from the Persians, who were rapidly expanding their empire and making advances towards Greece and its province of Macedon. Philip had made alliances with many of the Persian opponents. By 337 BC, he had given refuge to several Persian noblemen. Alexander was in the court of his father by this time, as he was 20 years old. He heard firsthand many of the issues which would arise from the Persians. He valued these men's valor. King Philip then went into Asia Minor to liberate Greek settlements from the Persians. All seemed to be going well, as Philip and his 10,000 men strong army were victorious. However, when Philip returned to Macedonia, everything was about to change for Philip. In 336 BC, Philip married another noble woman named Cleopatra. Olympia was furious at this move from her husband king. This obviously caused tensions in the family, as Olympia and her son Alexander fled into exile in Epirus, where Olympia's brother was king. Historians are divided on what happened next, but the theory I like to believe goes as follows. A personal guard of the King Philip was working with Olympia, who wanted her son to become king of Macedon. Alexander returned to Macedonia without his mother, and then it happened. King Philip was assassinated by his guard. Olympia returned home on the night of this incident. Many believe that Olympia was behind Philip's assassination. Immediately, while Philip's body was still warm, the nobles and army proclaimed Alexander as the new king. He was 20 years old. This was the moment that Alexander would start his journey on becoming one of history's most notable figures, creating one of the biggest empires the world had ever seen. When Alexander became king, the Persians were ruling over their vast empire, including Egypt. For many years, Alexander had several campaigns against Persian invasion. However, in 333 BC, Alexander fought against the Persian king Darius. This battle is known as the Battle of Issus. This is where Alexander had chased the Persian king back into Egypt. Naturally, Alexander followed Darius further south toward Egypt. Along the way, Alexander had taken control over many of the Persian-ruled cities. It was at Gaza, a city that the Persians had taken over in 332 BC. After 3 attempts, Alexander again defeated the Persians. Darius again fled, but this time went back to Persia. With this battle, the Persian rule in Egypt came to an end. Alexander was finally able to enter Egypt. At Pompeii in Italy, a mosaic in the house of a noble Greco-Egyptian man was created 100 years after Alexander chased the Persians out of Egypt. This beautiful mosaic, made from 1.5 million tiles, shows the moment Alexander the Great caused Darius to flee back to Persepolis. This mosaic has a perfect home in Pompeii, as many of the people living there did have Greek and Egyptian roots. They wanted to pay tribute to the great Alexander. Now that Darius had surrendered Egypt, Alexander was about to be given the ultimate title. He was about to become a god. Upon entering the Egyptian border in mid-332 BC, Alexander was greeted by the Egyptian people with open arms as their liberator from the Persians. But why would the local Egyptians do this? The answers can be found in an Egyptian tomb dating back 1,400 years prior to Alexander's arrival, to around 1,700 BC. On Luxor's west bank, a tomb of the nobleman named Rekhmira shows a great relationship between Greeks and Egyptians. In this tomb, we can see the Minoan Greeks arriving in Egypt with many gifts for the pharaoh Thutmosis III. The tomb of Rekhmira shows us people from all over the world bringing offerings to Egypt. We can see men from Nubia bringing in a beautiful giraffe with a monkey holding the giraffe's neck. More Nubian men bringing in ostrich feathers and carrying ostrich eggs. Ivory from elephants, wood, baboons, even a cheetah. It is so incredible to see this. All the offerings arriving from Nubia. At the top, we have the people from Crete, the Greeks, bringing in jewelry, gold, and vessels, and probably containing wine or even beer, presenting it to Rekhmira to count, to add into the tax breakdown for Pharaoh Thutmosis III. And just a few hundred years later, in the reign of Ramses II, the Mycenaeans were also known to have close ties with the pharaoh. Bronze Greek armor has been found in Greece, with the cartouche of Ramses II stamped on, as they served in the Egyptian army. Even the wife and queen of Ramses, Nefertari, is known to have exchanged letters and gifts with the Greek queens. They, in return, sent Nefertari some beautiful gifts, including a pair of silver earrings that Nefertari shows in her tomb with great pride. You see, for thousands of years, the Egyptians had faced wars with every country neighboring them, all except one: Greece. The ancient Egyptians and the Greeks always had a good camaraderie, and with that in mind, it makes perfect sense that the Egyptians welcomed Alexander to Egypt. The legend says that upon his arrival in Egypt, a large flock of birds were flying to the west. An Egyptian priest told Alexander that this was a sign and that he should follow the birds. Alexander and his men followed these birds and arrived at a distant place in the middle of the desert, an oasis, Siwa. This is where Alexander's dreams would become a reality. They rode through this landscape, which has scarcely changed since then, arriving at this mount. Here was the temple of Amon that housed the oracle. The temple was built around 700 BC by Greek mercenaries who settled in the area. The temple is a unique mix of Egyptian and Greek architecture, built right at the edge of the hill. Throughout history, many notable people would come to this temple to ask questions to the god Amon, where the oracle priest would answer on behalf of the god. This is where one of history's most powerful men once visited. I'm literally walking in the same footsteps as Alexander the Great. Up these steps, I'm gonna take you in the Amon temple where Alexander received his message from the oracle. However, What happened in these hallowed halls remains somewhat of a mystery still.
So this is where Alexander would have walked into. Coming here, right in the center, would be the statue of Amon-Ra. And Alexander would have spoken to Amon, asked him whatever questions took place, we're not exactly sure. And Amon spoke back to him. When Amon spoke back to him, he said, Alexandros, you are my son. And this legitimized Alexander's claim to becoming a pharaoh. Alexander would have left. As he left, he swept away his footprints. He was given a broom from one of the priests. He swept away his footprints and left the room. This is one version of the story. Now, there is a debate happening as to exactly how the oracle gave him this message. The oracle is, of course, a high priest that would probably take a hallucinogenic and see these visions and speak as the voice of the god. The voice would come either from above or from below. We're not exactly sure on which one of these theories is correct. In this room, I believe we would have had the statue of Amon. It makes sense. All Egyptian temples show the god in the central room. And above, there is a ledge and a window. And I believe it is that window where the oracle would have sat and spoken down. And Alexander would have heard that voice, believing it to be the voice of Amon himself. We have this little passage on the side here where it's blocked off now, but long ago there's a staircase going up to that exact window that I spoke about now, where I believe the oracle would sit and speak down as the voice of Amon. This is the one that I like to believe. This is where the oracle was in the version of the story I like. There's another version where they believe in this room, in the third room. Down here is a well with an entrance from the outside. Because on the other side of this wall, it is a steep cliff on the mountain. The oracle or the high priest would come in through this doorway, go into the well, and speak up as the voice of Amon. And in this room, we have the area where the sound could come through, like a well, and through the hole here in the ground, you can see the sunlight coming through. That would connect and the sound could come through. And it's believed that over here would have stood, in one of the versions, the statue of Amon, and the oracle's voice would come out from here. So there is a debate going around as to exactly which room this took place in. I prefer the central room as it makes more sense with Egyptian beliefs. A third theory, which is a combination of both, which is Alexander came into this room. There was already a carved window here. The oracle went up the stairs and spoke through that window, which is more likely because we have the Temple of Horus, where we have the window above, which has the oracle speaking from above. So that makes more sense than a well. Alexander would have come and stood exactly on this block that I'm standing on now, and looked through this hole and spoke to Amon through the hole. And he would not be able to see the oracle sitting above. It's blocked off, thus creating the illusion that it is the statue of Amon speaking. And he could speak to Amon through here, because only the high priest and a pharaoh was allowed to go into the main sanctuary. And Alexander would speak to Amon through here, and this is where he received his message, on this block, standing here speaking to the god. So we're not exactly sure which version of the story to believe. I prefer the first one, where Alexander was allowed right in front of the priest. But all three of these stories are plausible.
Once Alexander was proclaimed as the son of Amon, he allegedly was processioned through the village, accompanied by 80 priests of Amon. Amon was the principal god of Egypt. He was also known as the god of the gods. He was seen as the equal to the Greek god Zeus, and in many instances they were combined, creating Zeus Amon. Very few images still remain in the temple, yet we can see some scenes of Amon with his wife Mut. The cartouche of Pharaoh Amasis has been found in this site, which makes even more sense being built by Greek mercenaries, as Pharaoh Amasis had sent much gold to help rebuild the burnt-down temple of Delphi in Greece. Of course, this temple is surrounded in myth. Perseus was said to have visited here before beheading Medusa, and Hercules may also have been here once. The temple and the village of Agurmi surrounding it was said to have been founded by two banished Theban priestesses, one of which went to Greece and founded the temple of Dodona. Another foundation myth is that the Greek god Dionysus was lost in the Libyan desert. Almost about to die from thirst, a figure appeared and led him to the spring of Agurmi. To give thanks for his life, he erected the temple and blessed the oasis to become forever fertile. All of these are good stories, but are myths. The reality is, it was built by the Greek mercenaries, the men that aided the Egyptian army. And many years later, even Alexander's father would come here.
Alexander the Great actually had a connection to Egypt before, right?
Yes, since it's Basmatic from the 26th dynasty, there's a trend of a large number of Greek, and they settled in Egypt as a mercenaries, because Basmatic used them as a mercenaries in his army.
Yes.
And also the relationship between Greece and Egypt, it is since very old time.
Thousands of years.
Thousands of years, and the trade ways also, and everything. Plus, the father of Alexander the Great, he was mercenary in Luxor.
Philip.
King Philip. He was mercenary in Luxor for a while, and he learned the technique, which it was since the time of Thutmose III.
Yes.
Make separate flanks and separate forces. So specific technique in a war. He learned it, and he taught Alexander that, which he used it later to make his empire.
So the Greeks and the Egyptians, they've always had this strong connection.
Yes.
We know from the time of Thutmose III, we can see the Greeks arriving in some of the tombs, and they're giving gifts.
Yes, and also you mentioned that before. Ramses II, he has a temple there in Greece, and it's headed
In Cyprus.
In Cyprus,
yeah.
So they do a lot of respect, and we don't forget also the god Serapis, which make it by Ptolemy I to unify the Egyptian and the Greece.
Exactly.
Of the Greek.
Exactly. Nefertari was writing letters to the Greeks.
Yeah.
She received gifts from the Greeks. So we have a long history of Egypt and Greece. And you know, Greece is the only country that Egypt never fought with.
Never. And until now, we have good relationship.
Yeah.
They said falafel and coffee and everything is Greek, and we said it's Egyptian.
And the biscuits and everything.
They said it's a Greek, and we say it's Egyptians. The war, it is a Greek.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Alexander's father was a mercenary in Luxor.
Yes.
But was that really Alexander's father?
Much myth even surrounds Alexander the Great. His mother Olympia often corresponded with her son during his campaigns. She tried to convince him that his father was not in fact Philip II, but rather that he was the son of a god. This gave rise to the medieval myth that the last native pharaoh of Egypt, Nectanebo, when he was conquered by the Persians, rather than fleeing south to Nubia, as was historically stated, that he went north to Greece, where he met with Olympia. He told her that the god Amon would visit her that night, and so Amon did, yet Olympia was deceived. Nectanebo was dressed in the guise of Amun and impregnated Olympia, thus conceiving Alexander the Great. Oh yes, this all sounds wonderful. However, this was merely a myth, but had it been true, it would be yet another feather in the cap for Alexander to explain why the Egyptians embraced him, as he would have had a claim to being Pharaoh, as he was supposedly the son of Pharaoh.
Philip played a crucial role in Alexander's life. In fact, without Philip, there couldn't have been an Alexander the Great. Philip's the one who reshaped northern Greece, making it stronger and more united. Philip's also the one who created the army that Alexander would inherit, and even the plan to attack Persia was Philip's. We have to remember that even Philip was relatively young when he came to the throne, and in such a short space of time he almost achieved the unthinkable. It's obvious he had an influence on Alexander's life, who would go on to surpass his father's accomplishments. But his relationship with his father was sometimes distant and fractured. Alexander was much closer to his mother. The dark side of Alexander, which would sometimes manifest itself in bouts of anger, acts of cruelty, and even destruction, was probably the result of the world in which he grew up in and the relationship he had with his parents. Even his mother was a strong individual who had high ambitions for her son. She's even implicated in the assassination of Philip. Whether or not this is true, after Alexander's father was killed, Alexander would leave and go on to conquer the world and never return to see his mother again. In fact, at no point does he call for his mother or even show the desire to see his mother again. All their communication would be through letters back and forth.
Alexander the Great, he wanted to prove to the Egyptians and to all the world that he is not only human, he's a son of God. So it will help him later when he make his empire, and it will help also his mission in Egypt to control them like the native pharaohs, sons of the gods.
Alexander left Siwa as the son of God. He ventured on and arrived in Memphis. The news had spread of the visit to Siwa. Alexander was then crowned as Pharaoh of all Egypt, gracing him with the red and white crowns and placing his name in a royal cartouche. Here at Memphis, Alexander gave many offerings to the god Ptah, the chief regional god of Memphis. Being Pharaoh, Alexander became even more powerful. The army of Egypt would be at his disposal, and the wealth of Egypt would help him to expand his empire. After his coronation in Memphis, Alexander went south to visit the home of his spiritual father Amon. He visited the great temple of Amon at Karnak. Now Pharaoh, he was allowed into the inner sanctuary, where a small golden statue of Amon rested in a shrine. Alexander would have come here and performed a ceremony reserved only for the pharaoh and the high priests.
The inner sanctuary at Karnak Temple, dedicated to Amon-Ra. Right in the center, we have this plinth where the statue of the god Amon would be placed. The boat would be placed here as well. Every morning the priests would come in, open the doors, and adorn the statue of Amon-Ra with oils, makeup, leave offerings, and before they left they would sweep their footprints away, leaving the house of the god in immaculate state. This, right here, was the center of ancient Egypt.
slight traces of Alexander remain on the walls of this sanctuary. In the grounds of Karnak, a large statue depicting Alexander would be erected. He wears the Egyptian Nemes headdress, yet appears as a Greek, with his hair poking through the band and his neck slightly tilted to one side, a characteristic from all depictions of Alexander. The newly crowned foreign pharaoh would then visit the Ipet Reset Temple, the southern sanctuary, now known as Luxor Temple. At Luxor Temple, Alexander commissioned the inner sanctuary to be extended. He had a new shrine built in the existing sanctuary, where he showed himself giving many offerings to Amon, wearing various crowns of Egypt, like the blue Kepresh war crown.
We can see Alexander and Amon-Min. We know it's Alexander from his name.
Yeah.
Alexandros.
Yeah.
Alexandros.
Alexandros.
Here we have Alexander the Great offering jars to Amon-Min with his erect, circumcised penis.
Yes.
But there's something interesting happening here that you told me about. What's going on, Lami?
Something coming out from the semen because Amon-Men ejaculating in front of Alexander the Great. So from semen, there's something similar to sperm comes out. We have controversial here. Some people said the thickest was here, and someone he just connect between the seam and also the penis of Amon. So it's controversial. Until now, we can understand really what's going on. If it's a sperm, did the ancient Egyptian invent microscopes?
I doubt that.
Yeah.
They knew something.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. But it's interesting we see that because we have a festival once a year where the pharaoh had to ejaculate into the Nile
Yeah.
to keep the Nile fertile in front of an audience.
Yeah.
So
it is very weird, and at the same time part of their culture. We can understand it, but by their time it's very understood.
Yeah.
Or acceptable too.
Yeah. In the inner sanctuary at Luxor Temple would have been housed the boat that had the statue of the god Khonsu, the son of Amon and Mut. The boat for Khonsu had the head of a ram, a symbol for the son of Amon. And once a year, the boat would be taken out and brought to Karnak Temple down the Avenue of Sphinxes.
Alexander the Great here, he wear the crown of South, and there he wear the crown of North. And behind him, the provinces of ancient Egypt in South. Above each one of them, the name of the province. So here we have like Itfu, and here we have a female, the only exception here. Do you know why? Because she is Luxor, Waset. He wanted to recognize Luxor and make Luxor like distinguished. That's why he made it as a lady.
A pharaoh was seen as the reincarnation of Horus, and thus Alexander's wish had come true. He was a god. Being the son of Amon, too, meant he was a god on earth. It would have been here in Luxor where Alexander saw the power of the pharaohs. Amongst them was Ramses II. Alexander saw the might of this king and the empire he wielded strewn across the walls of the temples. Alexander would adopt the symbol which mighty pharaohs like Ramses had been ordained to wear. He showed himself wearing the curved ram's horns, showing the sheer power connected to Amon. Inside this smaller section of Luxor Temple is a piece of Ramses II, shown here with the ram's horns of Amon, the ram's horns that would be repeated by every pharaoh that wanted to be connected to the reign of Ramses the Great. Alexander emulated the great pharaohs such as Ramses to take on their strength to build his empire. He commissioned new coins of himself, showing the ram's horns of Amon, so that all throughout his empire would know he was Pharaoh.
We don't often see Alexander the Great depicted as an Egyptian or even as a pharaoh, only on a couple of statues and carvings. However, here we have something so unique. It is Alexander depicted as the god Hapi before an offering table with fish and plants hanging off of the offering table. Isn't he just the most magnificent example of Greek and Egyptian art combined? One of Alexander the Great's favorite things that he found when he came to Egypt was the hoopoe bird, and he had it depicted in many temples. And this here is the favorite bird of Alexander the Great.
Alexander then went up north to the Nile Delta and visited the ancient city of Bubastis. In this city, many artifacts pertaining to Alexander were found, like thousands of silver coins, and a terracotta statue showing Alexander as the god Hercules, showing he had a presence in the city. Alexander was not pleased with the taxation system in Egypt, and installed new laws implementing the Greek tax systems. Thus, he would make sure that the tributes given would not be misused by any of the priests.
In 332 BC, Semitawi saw the liberation of Egypt from the Persians by Alexander the Great.
This stela was discovered in Pompeii, Italy. It was written by the Egyptian officialman named Semitawi of his accounts of when Alexander expelled the Persians from Egypt.
This is the stela of Semitawi. After Alexander the Great left his short stay in Egypt, however, he remained pharaoh. Semitawi wrote down his accounts of Alexander defeating the Persians. And shortly after Alexander left Egypt, Semitawi became the high priest of the son of Isis, Horus.
Alexander set his sights north. He arrived at the Egyptian Mediterranean Sea. There, he is said to have taken birdseed and drawn out a city plan on the ground, thus founding what would become the most powerful city, not only in Egypt, but most of the known world, Alexandria. Alexander would found over 20 cities named after himself. Yet, the Egyptian Alexandria would be the most important and prosperous of all. The great Alexander did not stay in Egypt long. After around 6 months, he left Egypt in 331 BC, setting his sights to finally defeat Darius and the Persians. After conquering Darius, walking through the gates of Ishtar, Alexander was now also the king of Persia. Alexander went on to conquer as far as India.
Alexander was born great. He achieved greatness, and he had greatness thrust upon him. Decisions made by leaders can have a profound effect on the course of history, and Alexander and his father Philip provide the clearest example of this. In less than 4 decades, Greece would be dominated, Persia, the superpower of the time, would be attacked and defeated, and several other regions would be humbled. Alexander almost achieved global dominance. He went as far as the Hindu Kush and what is now Pakistan. In fact, his presence can still be felt in Pakistan. The wonderful Kalash people who live in the region of Chitral claim to be the descendants of Alexander's army. Their traditions, culture, and religious practices are so unique and different from the rest of the region. But what shaped Alexander to become this formidable opponent on the battleground and an unconventional figure with a great mind, charisma, and determination?
He remained the Pharaoh of Egypt for 10 years, yet something would happen to Alexander that he could not conquer. He arrived back in Babylon in June 323 BC. Alexander died. We do not know the exact cause of his death, other than it being mentioned that he had a fever. His death would now cause a fierce power battle between Alexander's court as to who would rule the empire. It seems to have been divided up. The half-brother of Alexander the Great would become the next crowned pharaoh of Egypt, Philip III. Philip proved to be a very weak king of Egypt and Macedon, and served as more of a puppet controlled by more powerful people. Philip III wanted to emulate Alexander the Great. He depicted himself at Karnak Temple. On the outside of Amun's inner shrine are many images of Pharaoh Philip. He is shown being crowned by Amun. And other scenes show Alexander's half-brother giving offerings to the gods. Here he is, Philip II. We can see his name up there. P, which is the box, L-I-P, Philip. He was trying to show to the Egyptian people that he was worthy of this title. The same way Alexander was, being seen directly with the gods in the most important temple in all of Egypt. A few months after Philip III was named as pharaoh in 322 BC, Roxanne, one of the wives of Alexander, gave birth to a son named Alexander IV. This young son of Alexander was then also named as Pharaoh of Egypt and King of Macedon, therefore co-ruling with Philip III. But Alexander IV was only an infant. He was used just as much as Philip was by other people to make their claims of the empire. Though all this time Olympia was not pleased with the son of her dead husband and his other wife being the king of Macedon and Egypt, Olympia returned from exile to Macedonia. Alexander's men refused to kill the woman who bore the most incredible man they had known. However, she conspired against them all, having many of the commanders' families killed, and eventually, in 317 BC, Olympia had Philip III murdered. But what happened to Olympia now, the mother of Alexander the Great? The loyal followers of Alexander did not want to kill her. However, they decided that if they got someone else to kill her, it would be acceptable. In 316 BC, Cassander ordered the families of those that Olympia had murdered to commit a violent act. They stoned Olympia to death. In 309 BC, Alexander the Great's son was executed before turning 14 years old, the age at which a Macedonian boy could fully rule. There is a second son of Alexander the Great. However, many debate him as being illegitimate, as many of the Greek and Macedonians refused him as Alexander the Great's son from a mistress. But to be sure, they murdered Heracles, the supposed illegitimate son of Alexander the Great. Thus, the entire line of Alexander's family were now gone. Many years of civil war would break out between the rulers of Alexander's empire. Through many events, an army general and supposed cousin of Alexander from Olympia's side, named Ptolemy, would become full reigning pharaoh of Egypt. And he would create a long dynasty of Ptolemaic rulers, ending with the final Greek ruler of Egypt, Cleopatra. This is not the end of Alexander's story, though. For millennia, there has been a debate about where the great conqueror had been buried. For you see, holding Alexander's body would have some sort of threshold over the empire. Alexander had been buried in Egyptian style, as this was the religion that he was leaning toward the most. Ptolemy I is said to have moved Alexander's body a few times, leaving Egyptologists, archaeologists, and historians with a real mystery on their hands. At Saqqara, near the ancient capital of Memphis, is something that looks surprisingly un-Egyptian.
In Saqqara, we find an intriguing semicircle of statues that seem somewhat out of place. Despite their poor preservation, these statues provide an insight into art and cultural development under the Ptolemies. Presently, their surface is quite coarse, but originally they were probably covered in stucco and painted. The statues are thought to be of some of the greatest classical Greek poets and philosophers, including Homer, who wrote the Iliad, a copy of which Alexander is thought to have kept with him during his conquest. There's also the poet Pindar and the famous philosopher Plato, who taught Aristotle, who in turn would go on to teach Alexander the Great.
Alexander has done so much in his lifetime, yet for me, Alexander will always be one of my favorite pharaohs. With all that Alexander accomplished, the empire he forged, the myths surrounding him, and the fact that we still speak about him today, and he is still so much part of the world we live in, it is no wonder that he is known as Alexander the Great. This is Cleopatra, a pharaoh, ruler of Egypt. But who was she really? Too much focus on her sexuality, too much on her lovers, not enough about the real Cleopatra. Coming to Berlin in Germany, we can come face to face with this mysterious woman.
Here at the Altes Museum in Berlin, in Germany, they have some of the most amazing Greek art, and they have something that I've really been looking forward to see, a bust believed to be Cleopatra.
There is so much myth around her. Cleopatra's story has changed and evolved over the years, so much that we get lost when looking for the real facts surrounding her.
What we're looking at here is a statue from a private villa in Rome, and this is a bust
Believed to be
Cleopatra, Cleopatra VII, the final pharaoh of Egypt.
She is identified as Cleopatra because she was discovered next to a statue of Julius Caesar.
She does resemble the images we have of Cleopatra on coin form. And what's interesting, the images of Cleopatra on the coin form show her wearing this band across her head, the waved hair on the side, and a little bun at the back of her neck. So this very well could be the face of the Cleopatra.
A woman who tried to save Egypt, a political figure, and an incredibly tactile ruler. A figure whose name and legacy is burned into the minds of billions, coming from a tenacious Greek Macedonian family. She had to fight and even kill for her place on the throne, a noble attempt to save a failing Egypt.
Cleopatra was willing to do anything to retain Egypt.
She bore children from two of ancient Rome's most powerful men. She was a writer, an inventor, a scholar.
Thousands of years later, we're still talking either about the men in her life or what she looked like rather than her accomplishments.
She left her mark during the final days of ancient Egypt. The seventh queen in her family to be named Cleopatra.
Let us see if Cleopatra was black or not.
Her story has been warped so much throughout history, from biased opinions to praise. Yet, who was she really?
The heir to the throne had to be of pure Macedonian Greek blood.
Keep her dignity protected.
Everyone thinks they know her. Everyone has a different opinion, but most of those are modern, based on films and misinformed playwrights.
This is the reason why I've been searching for Cleopatra's tomb. I believe she deserved to be found.
How much do we rarely know about the true Cleopatra? To learn about Cleopatra, we must go back a few hundred years to how her family actually arrived in Egypt. The year was 332 BC. Egypt had been taken over by the Persians, who had made life for the population of Egypt quite uncomfortable. However, Egypt's salvation was on the horizon. A power was rising up against the Persians. This power was based in northern Greece, known as Macedonia. His name was Alexandros, or as we know him, Alexander the Great. He wanted what the Persians had. He wanted to take over their expanding empire as it was making advances towards Macedonia. Alexander arrived in Egypt and chased Darius and the Persians out. Egypt and Greece had good relations for hundreds of years prior. Ramses II and Nefertari had good ties to Greece, though one Egyptian pharaoh in particular, named Amasis in Greek, or Ahmos II, who reigned around 550 BC, had made allies even more with regions of Greece, and even sent 1,000 talents of gold to help rebuild the Temple of Delphi after it was burned down. He also married a Greek princess, Landishe.
It is thought that it is these good relations between the two countries that was the reason why the Egyptians welcomed the Macedonian Greek Alexander into Egypt with open arms uncontested. He was then crowned pharaoh and named as the son of the god Amon.
However, some suggest that a mythical tale imagined in around 150 BC tells us that the last Egyptian-born pharaoh, Nectanebo, had not fled south from the Persian invaders, but rather north into Greece, where he disguised himself as the god Amon and impregnated the mother of Alexander, thus conceiving Alexander the Great. This story is merely a myth and holds no historic merit, though some say that it was because of this tale that the Egyptians welcomed Alexander. Alexander adopted Egyptian custom, representing himself as a pharaoh, a title that he was most proud of. Alexander only stayed in Egypt a few months, founding the new capital city named Alexandria on the Egyptian Mediterranean, and building several small additions to existing Egyptian temples. He left Egypt, went to Persia, and beyond. When Alexander returned to Babylon in 323 BC, he mysteriously fell ill, and shortly died after entering the city. With his recognized son not yet born, the rulership of Alexander's empire was split up between his courtiers. The half-brother of Alexander ruled Egypt for a few years, with the then infant son of Alexander, named after his father, being only a figurehead and not a real pharaoh. Alexander IV was killed at age 13, and shortly after, another illegitimate son of Alexander the Great was also written out of the story. Other Macedonians made attempts to conquer Egypt, but it was Ptolemy I who was crowned as pharaoh from Cyprus.
Ptolemy I, he was Macedonian Greek, but after him it starts getting messy and confusing. And this is because brothers were marrying sisters, uncles were marrying nieces, and fathers were marrying their stepdaughters, and in between these marriage unions they were also killing each other.
Ptolemy I was an army general of Alexander and his personal bodyguard, and showed great support for the followers of Alexander who defended Egypt, and some vague historical accounts mention Ptolemy was a cousin or even a half-brother of Alexander. Thus, Ptolemy became pharaoh of Egypt and founded the Ptolemaic dynasty, the family that gave us Cleopatra VII.
To add further to the confusion, the men were all called Ptolemy, and the women were either Arsinoe, Berenike, or Cleopatra. So our Cleopatra is actually Cleopatra VII.
Many years later, after the start of the Ptolemaic dynasty, their final pharaoh was about to emerge.
Cleopatra's family tree is very complicated. In fact, to say it's complicated is an understatement. It's like navigating your way through a complex maze full of twists and turns and dead ends, and when you finally make it to the end, you're more confused and wonder how you got there.
The year was 69 BC. Cleopatra VII was born. She was said to become the most revered of all the Cleopatras.
A very ambitious queen, a very intelligent queen, that she did learn languages. Was amazing. In that time, only men can go to study.
Cleopatra was formally educated, most likely at the great learning center known as the Museum. Cleopatra was the first of the Ptolemaic ruler who speak Egyptian.
She was born in Alexandria, Egypt, the only Ptolemaic ruler who learned and spoke the Egyptian language. So for me, in a way or another, she was an Egyptian queen. To me, as an Egyptian, this is how I see Cleopatra.
Cleopatra, she was a unique person, and she wrote the hieroglyphs, by the way. And Cleopatra, she spoke, for example, Aramaic, Hebrew, ancient Egyptian language, Greek, Latin, and she cared about all the kind of knowledge, astronomy, philosophy of ancient Greece and ancient Egypt, and also the religion of ancient Egypt. She knows all the gods. She had like large knowledge about ancient Egypt, and the lady, she had a dignity.
Cleopatra had the best education available. During the Ptolemaic period, Alexandria became the cultural hub of learning, and it all began with the vision of Ptolemy I. He wanted to amass education and knowledge from all over the world and have it in one place, and I think he got pretty close to achieving this. Alexandria attracted scholars from all over the world, some of the greatest minds ever. And during its peak, the Alexandrian library amassed about 500,000 books. Every time a ship would come to the Alexandrian harbor, if there were any books on board, they would take these books, get them copied, and then return them back to the owner. Egypt, apart from grain, also controlled the paper trade, so they became the greatest exporters of books. There was a whole institutional complex where they could gather, and some of the greatest minds would share their ideas. The Ptolemies wanted to make sure that they stayed there, so they gave them great living standards. So this is the social, educational environment in which Cleopatra grew up, and she thrived in this environment and excelled. And I think she was a bit of a child prodigy, and her father, Ptolemy XII, saw something special in her from a very young age, and he therefore trained her to become the next pharaoh. He trained her to become fantastic at public speaking, and she managed to learn 9 languages. That's remarkable. And Plutarch tells us that she flowed from one language to another with ease, and she spoke them beautifully, which makes me think that she learned these languages from a very young age. And not only did she excel in languages, she would have learned literature, astronomy, mathematics, and it looks like she had an interest in medicine as well, because there are some medical treatises which are assigned to her in dermatology. So she was a very exceptional, intelligent woman.
Cleopatra's parentage is widely disputed. Many ancient sources have various opinions. Her father, Ptolemy XII, Uletis, was the son of Pharaoh Ptolemy IX. Uletis' mother is disputed. Cleopatra Selene is suggested, as it is known that she bore 2 children. His second wife, Cleopatra IV, is a candidate, but it is not certain. The ancient writer, around 100 BC, Pompeius Trogus, has referred to Ptolemy Uletis as the bastard son, while Cicero makes mention of a half-Greek, half-Syrian consort being the mother of Uletis. This would make sense, as Uletis spent most of his life in and around Syria.
He wasn't that popular with the Romans. They didn't really, they hurled a lot of abuse his way. One of the insults that the Romans particularly enjoyed was to call him the illegitimate. Now, I've toned it down, but they said this quite a lot. Cleopatra I was actually born in Syria. She was the daughter of the Seleucid king. Her mother was Greek and Persian, and she married Ptolemy V. Now, Ptolemy V's claim to fame is the Rosetta Stone, which, of course, is responsible for the decipherment of the ancient Egyptian language. So on this stone, he basically lists all his accomplishments, all the good deeds he did. He's basically letting us know that he was a great guy. And him and Cleopatra I have a daughter, and this is now Cleopatra II. But Cleopatra II goes a step further in that she marries both her brothers. So first she marries Ptolemy VI, and then when he dies, she marries Ptolemy VIII. She has children from both her husbands. One of her daughters is Cleopatra III. Move on to the third now. Cleopatra III ends up marrying her uncle and stepfather, Ptolemy VIII. And by this stage, Ptolemy VIII is married to mother and daughter. It gets very confusing. And then Cleopatra III, she has a daughter who is Cleopatra IV. Cleopatra IV is killed off by one of her sisters. And then we've got Cleopatra V and VI, who are a little bit more obscure.
The Ptolemaic dynasty never conceived out of their own bloodlines. A noble foreign woman would have been looked down upon, but ultimately seen as passable. Cleopatra VII's mother is also a matter of theory and opinion. Two women are strong possible candidates. Cleopatra V, also known as Tryphania, was the sister and wife of Ptolemy XII, Uletis. When they were married, a papyrus mentions their joint titles as Theo Philipatros kai Philadelphoi, which means of the father, brother and sister, the loving gods. She is also mentioned at two temples in Egypt, at Philae and at Edfu Temple, where she is called the daughter of the sun, mistress of the two lands, and female ruler. It is highly probable that her mother is the same woman as her brother.
Cleopatra V, her father was probably Ptolemy IX or Ptolemy X, but she's believed to have married Ptolemy XII, who is Cleopatra VII's father. Cleopatra V disappears from the records shortly after Cleopatra VII is born. So it could be that she died in childbirth, it could be that she was exiled, or perhaps she just didn't do anything that remarkable to be written about.
In 305 AD, the philosopher Porphyry talks about Cleopatra V dying in 69 BC during childbirth. This would have been the birth of Cleopatra VII. He goes on to mention that a daughter sharing the same name went on as co-regent while the father of the great Cleopatra was exiled to Rome. Strabo's account contradicts this, saying that Cleopatra V was the one who co-ruled with her daughter Berenice, while Ptolemy was exiled to Rome. Other texts suggest Cleopatra as having a half-Greek, half-Egyptian mother, who was a priestess of Ptah. Others suggest her mother was a half-Greek, half-Syrian woman that her father had known. Neither of these two women can be confirmed to having ever existed.
Do you think that it would have been okay for them to have concubines because they were so focused on keeping the bloodline within the family? The inbreeding was off the hook. I mean, Tutankhamun was also a victim of completely inbred.
Inbreeding.
Do you think they were allowed to have concubines?
No, I'm not aware of it, and what I am aware of is that always the heir to the throne had to be of pure Macedonian Greek blood.
Yeah.
So even if they had concubines on the side, the children of these concubines probably got nowhere in life. If her mother was an Alexandrian priestess, I don't think Cleopatra would have had the access to the throne.
The Syrian mother theory holds more bounds, since this is where Cleopatra fled to after conflicts with her brother. Yet the candidate of the wife of Ptolemy Auletes, known as Cleopatra V, is more likely considering the amount of inbreeding to keep the bloodlines pure.
So if Cleopatra was illegitimate, the Romans would have been shouting this from the rooftops, because the Romans that are responsible for her history are Romans that either detested her or had their own biases or their own agenda. And there isn't a single writer that says she was illegitimate, which means that she must have been born to Ptolemy XII's wife. So the only wife that we really know of is Cleopatra V.
If her mother had died in childbirth, then why should there be any mention of her? If her mother did oust her father and herself to Rome, why would there be any mention of her as a disgraced member of the family who turned on her own relations, as was a custom of the Ptolemaic rulers?
Let us see if Cleopatra was black or not.
The big question.
You know what I'm going to say? First of all, I am not against the black at all. But I would like to give facts about Cleopatra. Because look at the Macedonian queens and Macedonian princesses. There is no one who was really black. At the same time, look at all the statues that was made for Cleopatra. At least I know about 2 statues for Cleopatra. And all the coins that I discovered inside with Kathleen Martinez, the temple of Botosiris Magna, it does not show at all that Cleopatra was black. And I want to come to a very important point. It is not good to change history. It is not good to make a false history. Again, I am not against the black at all. If Egypt history was black, I will say that. But let us see if anyone will come and look at the scenes that shown on the temples of the New Kingdom and the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom. You always see the king smiting the enemies of Egypt. And the enemies of Egypt were actually Asiatics, African, and Libyan. Then you have 5 people in front of him. If you look at the face of the king and the face of the other enemies of Egypt, there is no one can say that the Egyptians were black at all.
Showed themselves as unique, as Egyptians.
The Egyptians were unique and they were different. We know in Dynasty 25, we know that Cush and Nepta ruled Egypt. And we have the first king who came was Banchi and Taharka and others. Then the black kings came to rule Egypt in the late period. They did not have anything to do with this great civilization, such as building tombs and temples and pyramids. If you look at the Meroitic pyramids that built in Sudan, it's not like the great pyramids that built in Egypt. Then we have to know that the black civilization, its origin was in Sudan and Nubia. And I would like to mention here, there is some people who tried to show that the origin of Egyptian is black. For example, we have 2 people from Brazilian came to the Civilization Museum and they took a photograph of a skeleton that was found in a small village near Sohag in Upper Egypt.
33,000 years old skeleton, which I had the opportunity to CT scan as well. He worked in quarries, and we can tell that from the changes that his work caused on his elbows as well as in his knees and patella. These are of the oldest skeletons in Africa.
These two Brazilians took photographs of the skeleton, and they went to Brazil and produced a false scenario that this skeleton was black. How can anyone on earth
It's not scientific.
find out if this skeleton can be black or white?
Mhm.
Also, when I was visiting Brazil, they do every year a parade. In this parade, it's celebrating that they are the origin of the Egyptians, but that's not true. Again, the black Kushite and the people in the south ruled Egypt in the late period, which is dynasty 25. I remember when I went to give a talk in Philadelphia, and I did say what I'm saying now. Many blacks were very upset with me, and they had a march against me. Again, I am not saying at all, I'm not against the black at all, but most of my good friends are really black. But I want here to say the truth, that Cleopatra was not black.
Según todos los vestigios arqueológicos, Cleopatra era de la raza caucásica. Tenemos las pinturas, los relieves, las estatuas de la gran reina de Egipto, Cleopatra. Todos confirman que Cleopatra fue de la raza caucásica. Con todo el respeto a la raza africana, Cleopatra no era africana. Cleopatra era caucásica. Y para dejarlo más claro, la raza caucásica es la raza que habita el norte de África, el sur de Europa. Cleopatra lo era. Cleopatra era de Macedonia originalmente y nació en Egipto. De nuevo, según todos los vestigios, Cleopatra era egipcia, era de la raza caucásica del norte de África.
Coins from her time would show her with typical Greek facial features.
There is a debate over who her mother was. Her mother might have been an Egyptian priestess from Alexandria. Here is where the debate comes. Ancient Egyptian does not necessarily mean black. Ancient Egyptian society was a multiracial society, the same way it is today. We are a multiracial society. Excluding Egyptians that are not of a darker skin tone from their heritage is not okay. And Africa is a huge continent. Africa is not only black. I'm Egyptian. I'm quite dark, but I have cousins and family members that look like you. They have colored eyes and they're white and they're still Egyptian. If we look at the Fayum portraits, for instance, the Fayum portraits for a long time, they were thought to belong to Greek inhabitants of Egypt. But recently they did DNA tests on the mummies where these portraits were placed on, and they all turned out to be Egyptian. And Egyptians came in all shades and in all colors, from very dark to very light. And Africa comes in all shades and all colors. Culturally appropriating a civilization or a culture to a certain specific skin color is not acceptable. But they're still African. I'm still African. You are still African, Curtis, because you're South African. Egyptians that are of pale skin are still African. Africa is inclusive. Africa is all of us. Egypt is inclusive, and referring to a certain civilization or a certain culture as black civilization or black culture, I think this is something to do with Americans' history and not the history of Africa. Africa has always been a multiracial continent, and it always will be.
Ulatis, who was living in Syria before being recalled back to Egypt and named as Pharaoh, then faced the threat of Roman invasion. He was good friends and allies with Rome, Julius Caesar, and Pompey. He made a trade deal to keep the Romans from invading, a deal that cost one entire year of revenue of the entire Egypt. Naturally, however, This caused the Egyptian people to suffer greatly financially. He was then exiled to Rome, taking his daughters, Cleopatra VII and Arsinoe, with him. Ptolemy XII's eldest daughter became pharaoh. In 55 BC, with assistance from Rome, Ptolemy returned to retake Egypt. He killed his daughter Berenice IV and was recrowned as pharaoh. 2 years later, he named his next daughter as co-regent, Cleopatra VII. A year after that, Ptolemy died.
Cleopatra was not an Egyptian. Cleopatra was a Ptolemaic lady. She was the last ruler of this dynasty. We know that the Greek people lived in Egypt for 300 years, and their role ended on 30 BC. And Cleopatra was the last queen. Cleopatra's father was Ptolemaic, number 12. And when he died, he wrote in his will that Cleopatra and her brother, Ptolemaic number 13, should be ruling Egypt.
When Cleopatra became co-regent with her brother, Ptolemy XIII, she would have been around 18 years old, and her brother was only 10. She took up the role as dominant ruler, since her brother was way too young to make decisions. We have seen this happen 1,400 years before, during the 18th dynasty, where Hatshepsut took up the role of pharaoh, since her stepson, Thutmose, was too young to rule. This was nothing uncommon in Egyptian history.
Do you think she had an easy upbringing living with the Ptolemies?
No, she did not. I mean, she witnessed her own sister being murdered by her own father. So, no.
After her father's death, Cleopatra took over an unstable country. She established her own political agenda and strengthened Egypt's economy, producing a wealthy kingdom. Cleopatra was an acute political leader, as well as being a charismatic, brave, and capable ruler for 20 years.
Cleopatra began attempts to revitalize Egypt's economy, changing the taxation laws for grain and various other agricultural reforms. She also proceeded forward with the construction of the largest temple at the site of Dendera, on a temple that her father was not able to complete. Dendera Temple is the only intact temple of Cleopatra that we can marvel on today.
The most decorated ceiling in all of ancient Egypt is here at Dendera.
With the interior painted in a vivid turquoise color, the terraced temple is gloriously decorated and dedicated to the goddess of love and beauty, Hathor. Then, an event occurred that would win over the displeased Egyptian population. The sacred bull in the temple at Memphis, near Thebes, had died. Cleopatra sailed down from Alexandria to Memphis with a replacement bull.
This event was commemorated on a stela where we see Cleopatra dressed as a male pharaoh, and she is seen giving offerings to the bull.
Another stela was erected in Fayum by priests, showing Cleopatra dressed in male attire, offering to the goddess Isis, a sign that the Egyptians were connecting Cleopatra to Isis more closely. It seems these types of happenings angered Cleopatra's brother and his advisors, and only after 1 year of co-rulership, Cleopatra is tumultuously chased out of Egypt and fled to Syria. Ptolemy XIII then became a full pharaoh at the age of 12. While living in Syria, Cleopatra garnered up many supporters, and 2 years later, with her new army, she returned to Egypt to attempt to take back the throne. The plan was flawed. However, the gods were in her favor. General Pompey had fled to Egypt. Julius Caesar followed. Pompey was killed, and Caesar was able to wager some sort of peace between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII.
Hidden in the desert for a year, she smuggled into the royal palace while rolled up in a carpet and was revealed to Julius Caesar, the renowned Roman politician and army general.
Cleopatra consulted with Caesar on how she would get the throne of Egypt back. It was during this time that Cleopatra became entangled with Caesar. Their love affair bloomed while they lived together during the backlash from General Pompey's devoted followers, which Caesar eventually defeated from Alexandria.
During their stay together, Cleopatra became pregnant. Cleopatra knew that if she became the lover of Julius Caesar and had a child with him, especially a son, this would offer Cleopatra a certain level of protection. So she was very clever in her way of doing these kinds of things, and she knew that Julius Caesar would be less likely to invade Egypt and, conquer Egypt from his love and his son.
Yet, Cleopatra was not yet back on the throne. How would she accomplish this? Her sister, who has claimed herself as pharaoh alongside Ptolemy XIII, tried to besiege Caesar and Cleopatra. She did manage to regain some power and killed the army general, and instated herself as first in command of Egypt, an act that offended Caesar and Cleopatra. Caesar, seeking revenge, assisted Cleopatra in killing Ptolemy XIII.
It is written that he simply drowned in the Nile, which at that time is simple code for he died. Cleopatra was willing to do anything to retain Egypt.
Caesar did have certain ultimatums for Cleopatra. She was to ceremonially marry her next brother, Ptolemy XIV, who was around 11 years old, but she still retained royal power. This way, there was still a male figurehead, as Romans valued males more. Cleopatra was also ordered to pay more tributes to Rome for allowing her family to remain on the throne. After agreeing, she was re-pharaohed. A son was born, Caesarion. Cleopatra then invited Caesar on a cruise down the Nile, where she showed off the beauty of her country and escorted him around Dendera Temple. This would have been where Cleopatra showed off a special scene at the back wall of the temple she was commissioning.
The most famous scene of Cleopatra that's shown at the entrance of the temple of Dendera, the temple of goddess Hathor, goddess of beauty and love, it shows her with her son.
And here we have the main pharaoh of this temple, Cleopatra VII, with in front of her is Caesar. Next to Caesar is their son, presented as the son of Hathor, since Cleopatra was Hathor, Isis on earth. Ibi, the son of Hathor here, is in fact the son of Cleopatra and Caesar, Caesarion. On the opposite wall is Cleopatra shaking a sistrum with a man in front of her who is burning incense to the gods. This man is a representation of what she hoped Caesarion would grow up to be. This is one of the best images that we have of Cleopatra, one of the only remaining images. And above her is her name. On the left cartouche, actually, spells out the name of Cleopatra. C, L is the lion, E is the reed, O is the rope, Cleo, P is the box, Cleopa, A is the bird, and then we have hand, and that is actually the D sound, not the T sound. So we have Cleopatra. So we might actually be pronouncing her name incorrectly. It's not Cleopatra, because clearly written here in hieroglyphs, it is Cleopatra.
In 46 BC, Julius Caesar had fully destroyed the followers of General Pompey. Caesar returned to Rome for a lavish celebration, where he had a parade of foreign enemies that he defeated. Cleopatra accompanied Caesar to Rome for this event. One enemy of Caesar in particular was paraded through Rome. Cleopatra's sister, Arsinoe, who had made moves against Cleopatra, was chained up and humiliated in the parade, alongside a scaled replica of the Alexandria lighthouse, where Arsinoe and the army attacked Caesar and Cleopatra. Arsinoe was then exiled to modern-day Turkey. The year 44 BC would mark a major turning point in the life of Cleopatra. On another visit to Rome, herself, her son Caesarion, and Ptolemy stayed at Caesar's personal villa.
We know that she lived in Rome for almost 1 year with Caesar.
The returning presence of Cleopatra with Caesar's son was not welcomed.
When Cleopatra arrived in Rome, how do you think she was received in Rome?
We know that there was some sort of a big parade happening at her arrival, and there is a letter from a bystander. He said that he'd never seen dotted camels in his life before, and by dotted camels he meant giraffes. So she had giraffes in her parade. So it must have been quite a circus, really. I don't think she was well received by the Senate. That's for sure, and I don't think she was well received by Julius Caesar's wife either.
At the villa, Cleopatra meets the writer Cicero, who had nothing but bad things to say about the Egyptian female pharaoh.
Cicero called Cleopatra arrogant, and this is where we first hear him name Cleopatra as Caesar's Egyptian whore. The ancient Roman writers really did not like Cleopatra that much, and it's understandable if we think about the times that she was living in. Rome valued men way more than women. So by calling Cleopatra the Egyptian whore, it is an insult to her. They saw Cleopatra as a threat, and that is why they wrote such bad things about her, because they couldn't believe that a woman was in charge of such a rich and abundant country such as Egypt. And so the only way they could justify this was by calling her Caesar's Egyptian whore, the woman that got Caesar to allow her to retain Egypt. So that's really where we get this misconception. Cleopatra had 2 boyfriends in her entire lifetime. How does that make her a whore?
On this visit, Caesar goes as far as to erect a statue of Cleopatra in the Temple of Venus, portraying the queen connected to the Egyptian goddess Isis as Venus herself.
Cleopatra is one of the most intriguing historical figures, but sadly her story is one that is written by men, and men that despised her or had their own biases that shaped their narrative of her. She was, after all, considered an enemy of Rome, and those writing about her lived in an empire that was founded on her defeat. So we're left with convoluted versions of who she actually was. It's interesting that her life is depicted to center on two very powerful men. But I'm more interested in the gaps where these two men are not in her life. Was her story there? Because she was so much more than these two men. If we read between the lines, we get glimpses of admiration for her intelligence, her magnetic personality, and her charm. That's the part of her life that I'm more interested in. And it's also interesting that even in the modern era, the focus has shifted a lot back onto her looks. What did she look like? Was she beautiful? And in the age of social media and filtered images, what's considered beautiful, the bar's been set so high that it's become unachievable. So I find it really interesting that thousands of years later, we're still talking either about the men in her life or what she looked like rather than her accomplishments. So if we look at writers such as Dio, for example, who was writing in the 3rd century AD, he describes her as stunning in the prime of her youth. So he's ageist as well. And even when he's describing Antony's funeral, again, he's talking about what she looked like. And then we've got Octavian, who in his propaganda describes her as a beautiful witch who cast a spell on Antony, taking away any form of responsibility from Antony. Even the same with Caesar, she's described as using her looks against him. Whereas she was only 21, he was a man in his 50s, a known womanizer, lots of experience, very powerful. So it's interesting that all the blame shifts to her. I want to hear the other story of Cleopatra. I want to read between the lines and know more about her academia, the languages she spoke. I want to know more about that part of Cleopatra.
It was on this fateful visit that Julius Caesar was assassinated on March 15, 44 BC. Cleopatra, who thought that her son Caesarion would be the successor to Julius, stayed in Rome under protection for 1 more month. The minute she discovered that Julius's cousin was named in his will as successor, Cleopatra, Caesarion, and Ptolemy XIV fled back to Alexandria in Egypt.
Not to be outwitted, Cleopatra, shortly after returning home, knew that her then teenaged brother would try to take full control of Egypt and herself, as was the custom of this complicated family.
She poisoned her brother with aconitum, or, as we know it, wolfsbane. Cleopatra, being astute in alchemy and medicines, would have known that lacing food or drink with the root of wolfsbane would have caused her brother a fast death. Cleopatra and her physician had experimented on criminals with poisons. So she knew that the wolfsbane would make her brother's tongue swell, his throat close, and paralyze him. He would not be able to call out for help, and there would be no trace of bodily harm. Upon her brother's death, she declared herself and her infant son Caesarion as co-rulers over all Egypt. During this time, Cleopatra began to take on the role as reincarnated Isis even more seriously. She had the giant image of Isis carved onto the main pylon at Philae Temple.
in actual fact, the woman standing behind Horus, shown with a fuller face, fuller body, is actually Cleopatra the Seventh.
In accordance with Egyptian mythology, Cleopatra was born of goddess. She was believed to be the human incarnation of Isis, the most powerful female deity of ancient Egypt.
The goddess Isis was worshipped by the Greeks and by the Romans as well. Her cult spread throughout the Mediterranean. And here we have the Isis goddess shown as a Greek woman with an Egyptian headdress.
The heir of Julius Caesar was a young, unwell boy, Octavian, and thus another Roman was set in charge of the provinces of Rome. He was Mark Antony. Very soon after Cleopatra's return to Alexandria, Octavian had asked Cleopatra to send aid for his war against the assassins of Caesar. Cleopatra, in turn, not wanting to cause issue with Rome, accompanied a fleet of her ships and soldiers to Greece, but arrived too late to assist in the fighting.
I really believe that Cleopatra tried to have Octavius on her side.
By 42 BC, Mark Antony defeated the troops of Caesar's assassins. Octavian was in control of the Western Empire, Mark Antony, his nemesis, in control of the East. Mark Antony summoned her to come to Turkey so that they could discuss the future of Egypt within Rome. He also wanted to confront her about her assistance towards Octavian.
This notion of Octavian would have frightened the queen immensely.
Cleopatra delayed her leaving to Turkey as she had a tactic. She wanted to increase the anticipation of Mark Antony. Eventually, she set sail for Turkey. Cleopatra arrived on her mythical barge and was dressed in full Egyptian goddess regalia. Her plan to impress Mark Antony had worked. She had him in her hand. By having Mark on her side, he changed her status from a protected province to an independent monarchy. Abandoning his own wife in Rome and totally besotted with Cleopatra, Mark Antony goes back to Alexandria with his new love. It is there in Alexandria that Cleopatra goes above and beyond to keep Mark Antony impressed. She threw lavish feasts and debaucherous parties, some that went on for days. At these events, Cleopatra would appease the patron god of Mark Antony, Dionysus. In 40 BC, Cleopatra gave birth to twins. She named these children of Mark Antony as Alexander Helios, their son, and Cleopatra Selene, their daughter. Soon after, Mark was summoned back to Rome to make new ties with Octavian. He was to marry Octavian's sister, remaining in Rome for 3 more years. Conflicts between Octavian and Mark Antony rose to a pinnacle. Mark Antony left Rome and returned back to Cleopatra. He asked Cleopatra to fund his campaigns against Octavian and the East.
Surely not impressed with the return of the father of her children, who had gotten married while away in Rome, Cleopatra agreed. However, she did have terms. She wanted to make sure that Syria and Lebanon were given back to Egypt. She also wanted the assurance that her disgraced and exiled sister, Arsinoe, would be executed.
The war against Octavian was retracted. His sister had died, and this caused a temporary peace between Octavian and Mark Antony. Other wars were still on the go. Cleopatra accompanied Mark on a campaign against the Parthians. After many weeks making it to the border of the Euphrates River, Cleopatra was advised to return back to Egypt. She was now pregnant again, and in 36 BC, she gave birth to another son by Mark Antony, named Ptolemy Philadelphus.
In our modern view, some of the actions of Cleopatra could be seen as a political maneuvers rather than mere seduction. And I'm talking about her establishing relationship with Roman leaders, Caesar and Mark Antony. And this was to keep the independence of Egypt.
Mark Antony's battle against the Parthians was a disaster. They lost the battle. He retreated to Beirut. Cleopatra traveled north to meet with him and his troops. She advised him that it would not be wise to return to Rome after such a defeat. He returned with Cleopatra to Alexandria, where he met his new son. Cleopatra and Mark Antony had big plans together to rule their known world. They had asked the king of Armenia to marry their son, Alexander Helios, to the Armenian princess. The king of Armenia refused, and thus Mark Antony set off for Armenia with his troops and conquered them as an act of revenge. When he returned to Egypt, the couple had a large public parade. Mark paraded the prisoners of war to Cleopatra. It was written that at this event, Cleopatra was dressed in the guise of Isis. She is said to have declared that she was Queen of Kings and that Caesarion was King of Kings. She even proclaimed her infant son as king of their Armenia. It was at this event where they publicly announced their future plans. Cleopatra, also wanting to stamp her permanent mark, ordered new currency to be minted. Several coins showing the queen were created. These coins showed her in profile, wearing a Greek diadem and her hair in a Greek-styled bun. Some coins had Antony on the reverse, and some even had their children depicted. Cleopatra even had a large granite stela placed at Karnak Temple, the holiest site of Egypt. The stela shows Cleopatra and Caesarion making offerings to the patron gods of Thebes, Montu, the god of war, and the almighty god of gods, Amun. It wasn't long before the news reached Octavian about the announcements of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. Octavian publicly stated that Cleopatra had bewitched Mark Antony using her magic of Isis, that Mark Antony had illegally detained the king of Armenia, and that he had stolen books to stock the library of Alexandria, and that this marriage to Cleopatra was unlawful since he was married still to Octavian's sister. The final straw was when Octavian made a claim that Mark Antony wanted to conquer Rome and move the capital to Alexandria. The Roman Senate finally declares outright war against Cleopatra, resulting in a devastating naval battle. One item can bring us closer to Cleopatra than any other. It demonstrates her deep knowledge for diplomacy.
A papyrus from approximately 33 BC. Cleopatra signs a tax exemption for a man living in Alexandria. This man is a chief army commander and a financial backer of Mark Antony. By signing this tax exemption, Cleopatra knew that it was a good move because this man was somebody she wanted to keep on sides.
Cleopatra approves the tax exemption and signs it in her own handwriting, stating, "Let it be done."
In the late period, the priests had raised their power once again and increased their taxes. It was here at Kasr Karun that some of this drama played out. Going up the many flights of stairs, we enter an area once reserved only for priests and royals.
And when you come onto the roof of this temple, it's one of the very few temples where the roof is still fully intact. When you walk out here, you can see the settlements around, the Roman baths that were built, the houses where the priests and the farmers from the area that fed this temple would have lived. And I can just imagine when there was the strike happening just before Cleopatra died, people coming here complaining to the temple, "Where's our grain?" And the priest, who would have been too scared to go downstairs because he might have been taken out, would have stood up here, spoken to the people, "Your grain is on the way, we're waiting for the taxes, you haven't worshipped the gods justly," making all of these assumptions to the people why they were not receiving their food.
It is amazing that Cleopatra is able to remain in power for 19 years, although in her time there are droughts in Egypt and hunger prevails between the people. She has to open the silos for the people to find enough corn to eat.
Almost instantly, upon hearing that Rome has now officially declared war with Egypt, Cleopatra and Mark Antony went to Greece to seek counsel and aid in 31 BC. Many foreign kings agreed to assist Cleopatra, yet some, whom were once allies, turned their backs in fear of Octavian. Mark and his men urged Cleopatra to go back to Egypt. She insisted on staying for the war.
Cleopatra stated that she would rather tackle Octavian's troops in Greece as a way to block him from arriving in Egypt.
On September the 2nd, 31 BC, the naval forces of Egypt faced Rome in Greece at Actium. Cleopatra and Mark Antony led 60 ships towards those of Octavian. However, the battle was unsuccessful for Cleopatra. During the battle, many Egyptian and the allied ships were destroyed. Cleopatra and Mark Antony fled the scene while the battle was still taking place. This caused many of the allied ships to surrender. The battle had caused much embarrassment on the part of Mark Antony. He reportedly did not speak to Cleopatra for the next 3 days on their fleeing voyage. They arrived back in Egypt, not at Alexandria, but at a bay just out of the region. Antony boarded a ship and went to Cyrene in Greece, while Cleopatra returned to Alexandria. Cleopatra was now trying to make plans to save Egypt, but many allies that she had reached out to turned away from her and sided with Octavian after learning of the Battle of Actium. Cleopatra is suggested to have begun plans to retire to a foreign land and install her son, Caesarion, as full pharaoh.
She did in fact have a stela erected of her son Caesarion, showing him dressed as a full Egyptian before he was even crowned. This was in about January 30 BC.
The stela shows Caesarion making offerings to Atum, the creator god, the crocodile god Sobek, the fertility god Min, and of course, Isis. The cartouches are empty, showing that Caesarion had not yet been crowned as pharaoh, yet the text below mentions Cleopatra and her son. And this was placed at the center of religion in Egypt at Karnak Temple. Cleopatra made attempts to plead with Octavian. She wrote to him and asked that Mark Antony be exiled from Rome to Egypt and that her children remain in control of Egypt in exchange of yearly payments to Rome. In her letter, she said that if her requests were not met, that she would burn herself and the promised treasures in her tomb. After months of negotiating that led nowhere, Octavian set out to invade Egypt. He attacked Mark Antony and his troops in Cyrene. Defeating them, Mark Antony made a hastened journey back to Egypt. In 30 BC, in August, Octavian and his army attacked Alexandria. Mark Antony defended the city, resulting in Octavian's men withdrawing for a few hours. It was then that Mark Antony received news that Cleopatra was dead. Devastated and not seeing a way out of this mess without Cleopatra, he stabbed himself in the stomach to commit suicide.
However, this news of Cleopatra being dead was not true. It was a ploy. According to the accounts of Plutarch, Mark Antony's men were able to stabilize him and take him to Cleopatra.
At her tomb, he was able to speak to her, stating that she can trust Proculius. Mark Antony then died, aged 53. Others suggest he was already dead when taken to Cleopatra. The queen, who was about to set light to the tomb, was interrupted by Proculius, who demanded to take her to the palace to meet with Octavian. She pleaded to bury Mark Antony. He allowed her to wrap him as a mummy and laid him to rest inside her own tomb. Cleopatra was presented before Octavian, who had seized her 3 young children. The Roman historian Livy states that Octavian had agreed not to kill Cleopatra, but made no promise of not being taken to Rome. He quotes Cleopatra as shouting out, "I will not be led in a Roman triumph."
Cleopatra had seen her sister humiliated in the Roman parade, and she had no intention of becoming that.
But it was Octavian's dream that he should take Cleopatra as a prisoner to show in front of all the people in Rome, the lady, that she captured the hearts of Caesar and Mark Antony.
Finally, on the 10th of August, 30 BC, seeing no way out, no way to save Egypt, nor herself, Cleopatra kills herself at 39 years old. The death of Cleopatra is controversial. Many say she killed herself in her tomb. Many say she killed herself while imprisoned in the palace.
What we do know is that she was accompanied by 2 ladies in waiting who eventually killed themselves as well.
The myth goes that she had an Egyptian cobra bite her breast, and that is how she died. This theory has many holes in it. If she was in a rush to go to her tomb to kill herself, how did they get the time to get a snake? If the snake was delivered in a fruit bowl or a jug, the snake would have been visible, and the snake would have not had enough venom to kill Cleopatra and the 2 ladies in waiting.
Her body has never been discovered, so we have to rely on ancient sources to formulate a theory of what happened to her. The earliest account is by Greek historian Strabo. He tells us two different accounts. He tells us either she died of snake venom or a poisonous ointment. Then we have Greek physician Galen. He tells us that she bit her arm and then poured venom over it. And then we have Dio, who's writing a substantial length after she died. He tells us that she had 2 slight prick marks on her arms, thereby implicating a snake. But the most famous account by far is that by Plutarch. Now, I think the reason why his account is so famous because he says that his source is Cleopatra's physician Olympus. But it's difficult to know which part is by Olympus and where it becomes Plutarch's imagination. We don't actually have any writings by Olympus to go on, so we have to take his word for it. But what he tells us is that a peasant carried the snake in a basket full of figs, and the snake was concealed under some leaves. And then Cleopatra took the snake, put it on her arm, and let it bite her. And this is what killed her and her handmaidens as well. It's very tricky with his explanation because the actual cobra in question is way too large to conceal in a basket of figs. And also the other problem with this theory is that snakes don't always like to release their venom. Most of their bites are dry bites, so there's only about 10% chance of having a venomous bite. His theory just begins to crumble when you look at it in a little bit more detail. It's also interesting that he doesn't discuss the marks or any sort of... He tells us that she looked flawless.
Some Egyptologists say that Cleopatra killing herself with a snake, allowing it to bite her, was seen as a noble death. Well, maybe to the Greeks, being killed by a snake or committing suicide was a noble death. However, Cleopatra, who aligned herself with the beliefs of the ancient Egyptians, would have known that committing suicide or being bitten by a snake that you inflict upon yourself was a common sentence for convicted criminals. Surely a woman who was filled with pride of her ancient Egyptian belief system would not have taken the route to have herself bitten by a snake committing suicide. She would have known that this was not a noble Egyptian way to die.
Other sources, like Galen, mention a mark on the upper arm. Cleopatra's physician offers us a clearer and more reliable verdict on her death. Upon finding and examining the queen, he notes it was snake venom. Cleopatra, being well versed in the study of medicines and poisons, would have known that pouring a small amount of poison into an open cut would be enough to kill herself.
So there's a few theories of how she could have actually died. One of them is that she swallowed some poison, most likely hemlock and some wolfsbane. Now, the problem with this theory is that none of the sources actually say that she ingested, that she swallowed any poison. All of them refer to poison going straight into her bloodstream, so injecting the poison. And there would have been at least one source that would have said this, so it looks very unlikely. And also, drinking poison would have been excruciatingly painful. Hemlock can cause awful convulsions as well. So would she have wanted to inflict that kind of pain on herself? The other thing we have to remember is that Plutarch tells us that Cleopatra experimented with poisons because she wanted to find the one that inflicts the least pain. She's accused of carrying out these experiments on condemned prisoners. I think she cut herself and probably poured snake venom onto the wound, and this would have killed her with relatively quick speed and through respiratory failure. So this is probably the most plausible explanation because extracted snake venom stays lethal for quite a considerable length of time.
when she hears the Roman will offend her in front of her nation in Alexandria, she committed suicide by cobra rather than to be offended in front of her nation. So who can take this decision? Only a strong personality who can do this decision to commit suicide to keep her dignity protected. So a lot of respect and love to Cleopatra.
The tale of Cleopatra, including the political tactics, her love life, and even the mysterious death by an Egyptian cobra bite, this all spread throughout the world, and it helped to inspire poems, art, and plays like William Shakespeare and Egyptian Ahmed Shawqi, and even several Hollywood movies. So actually, even long before the Tutankhamun discovery, Cleopatra, she was actually the source of Egyptomania and of the world looking to Egypt.
Very different to the pharaonic ancient Egyptian history, the history of the Ptolemies in Egypt is very well documented by the Greek and Roman historians of that time.
In the Islamic world, El-Masudi in the 10th century writes that Cleopatra was amongst scholars.
Arab sources reveal that her knowledge of philosophy, law, history, culture, the arts, alchemy, medicine, and religion were vast. These sources also show Cleopatra to be an extraordinary and devout ruler, the author of several books in medicine and alchemy.
When Octavian saw Cleopatra dead, although enraged, he did allow Cleopatra to be embalmed and buried in her tomb alongside Mark Antony. This too is disputed.
Do you think that Octavian would have really afforded her a royal burial?
I doubt it, because we know that Octavian, or Augustus as he will later on be referred to, cleared all of Cleopatra's treasures and took them back with him to Rome. So even if he did bury her, it would have not been a royal burial. He was not going to let her get buried with tons and tons of gold. We know it is recorded that he left Alexandria with all of her treasures and all of her money.
I was involved in the search of the tomb of Cleopatra for about 12 years. I did join Catherine Martinez, and we worked together inside a temple called Tabu Osiris Magna. That temple is located west of Alexandria, and Catherine thought that Cleopatra and Mark Antony could be buried there. We started our excavation. We discovered many statues of Ptolemaic and also coins of Cleopatra and faces of Cleopatra. And the most important face that we found, it's a beautiful alabaster face, show Cleopatra as a very white woman. We also worked outside the temple of Tabu Osiris Magna, and we discovered a big, large cemetery. I really do not believe that Cleopatra was actually buried in this temple, but maybe she used this temple, because this temple in Tabu Osiris Magna was built for the goddess Isis, and maybe Cleopatra connected herself with Isis. Then maybe she could be visiting the temple, and this is why we have statues of many other Ptolemaic kings, and also for Cleopatra. And even we have evidence that this temple was built by Ptolemaic number 5.
One of the most intriguing queens and celebrities figures. This is the reason why I've been searching for Cleopatra's tomb. I believe she deserved to be found. I came out with a theory that Queen Cleopatra could be buried in a location 45 kilometers west of Alexandria, Taposiris Magna. I believe it could represent an important meaning for Queen Cleopatra, since she portrayed herself as goddess Isis, and Mark Antony used to dress as the representation of Osiris. And I believe, even though the location has never been even considered before, important objects has been discovered so far that link the temple to Queen Cleopatra. And I believe if there's any place that reunite all the conditions to be the final resting place of Queen Cleopatra, it will be Taposiris Magna.
We have a palace for Cleopatra. And this palace is located under the water now. And we know from historical facts that Cleopatra built a tomb for herself next door to this palace. Then maybe Cleopatra was buried inside this tomb. When I did my famous TV series, Chasing Mummies, I did go and I began to take some pillars from the palace of Cleopatra. Then we know that Cleopatra built a palace there.
Cleopatra did manage to send her son Caesarion away down south to Nubia en route to Ethiopia. While traveling, his mother died. Then Caesarion legally became pharaoh, but only for around 18 days before he was captured by Octavian's men and executed on the Romans' orders.
Cleopatra's 3 remaining children were eventually taken to Rome. They were paraded as prisoners. Her 2 sons would disappear, and her daughter was married off to an ally of Rome in Mauritania. She was queen of that land for quite some time, and requested many of her mother's scribes and scholars be sent to her. She had a son named Ptolemy, who went on to rule Mauritania for a short time before being executed by Caligula in 40 AD, and thus completely ending the Ptolemaic bloodline. Cleopatra's legacy lives on today, but let's try and look past the myth and focus on who she really was: a woman, a sister, a mother, a fighter, a queen, a pharaoh.